Welcome to Backroom, where gangster stories meet calm sleep. Here, we share the quieter side of history, the dreams and lives behind the legends, told softly to help you drift into peace. Tell us where you're listening from, and one good thing about your day. If you enjoy the stories, like and subscribe. Your support keeps these midnight tales alive. Now close your eyes and let the night take over. There is a silence that belongs to Sicily alone, a silence shaped by wind against cliff and by the slow breathing of the sea. In Castellamare del Golfo, the mornings begin pale and golden, the sky stretching out like a promise above the harbour. Stone houses cling to the hillside like memories that refuse to fade. Narrow roads curl downward toward the water, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Here, history does not live in books. It lives in the way one man looks at another. It lives in what is said and what is not. On one such morning, a young boy stood at the shoreline, his toes buried in warm sand. His name was Giuseppe Bonanno, though in time the world would know him as Joseph. He watched ships dissolve slowly into the horizon, their masts shrinking into pin-thin silhouettes. He did not yet know where those ships were bound, America, Tunisia, Marseille, only that beyond the horizon was a world where a man could reshape himself or disappear entirely. The sea whispered possibility, and the boy listened. Sicily, in those years, was a place of old laws that no government could erase. Family honor was not a phrase. It was the ground beneath one's feet. Loyalty was a language spoken without sound. And silence was the highest form of intelligence. People learned early that words were fragile things. Once released, they could not be retrieved. Joe's father was a man of stature, quiet but undeniable. He was respected in a way that had no single source. Respect in Sicily did not come from titles. It came from the way others adjusted themselves around you, who lowered their voice, who stood aside, who bowed first. Joe watched these details with a child's curiosity and a student's discipline. He understood that power did not always raise its voice. Often, it simply waited. When Joe was still young, his father died. The cause was unremarkable, but the absence was enormous. In Sicily, grief seldom appears as tears. It settles instead in stillness. The house grew quieter. Doors that had once been open remained half shut, and Joe, without being told, realized that life had changed its shape. Where protection had once stood, there was now space, and space demands awareness. His mother was strong in the way Sicilian women learned to be through necessity, not choice. She did not speak of fear, yet Joe saw it in the way she paused before answering a knock at the door, or how her eyes lingered a moment too long on the sea. In Sicily, the line between safety and danger is thin enough to be crossed by accident. The elders of Castellamare observed Joe closely. He was a quiet boy, a listener, a keeper of small details. He remembered faces, gestures, silences. He did not interrupt. He did not boast. He moved softly through rooms where decisions were made behind closed doors, where voices were low and careful. These traits mattered more than strength, more than age. They were the first signs of a man who could be trusted with things that were never written down, and yet Joe's childhood was not without beauty. He knew the scent of lemon groves after rain. He knew the warmth of late afternoons when the sea released the sun's heat back into the town. He knew festival nights when music drifted through open windows and laughter echoed like bells. Sicily could be harsh, but it was never empty. Still beneath all that warmth lay rules older than the stones of the churches. To belong was to obey. To obey was to survive. And to survive meant understanding that loyalty was not merely expected, it was required. As Joe grew older, the world around him began to shift. Men in the village spoke more frequently of America, a land not of dreams but of opportunity. A land where Sicilians carved communities inside cities of steel and smoke, where respect could be earned anew, where invisible networks of loyalty stretched across oceans. At 19, Joe made his choice. There was no dramatic farewell, no grand announcement. One morning, he simply walked toward the harbor. The dawn sky was still soft with sleep, its light barely touching the tiled rooftops of the town. He carried a small leather bag. Inside it were clothes, letters, and nothing else. The real luggage was invisible. The name he bore, the silence he had mastered, the expectations he carried from a land he would leave but never escape. The ship before him groaned against its moorings, smelling of salt and rust. The sea breeze lifted his hair from his forehead. A few fishermen paused their work to look at him, not with curiosity, but with understanding. Many had made that same walk. Many had watched others make it. Leaving Sicily was not unusual, but leaving without breaking the thread to it, that was something different. Joe looked back once, and only once. The cliffs were touched with early sunlight, the water still and calm. The town seemed suspended in time. Somewhere behind him, a door opened. Somewhere, a bell rang. Somewhere, a memory sealed itself. He stepped onto the ship. He was not yet a leader. Not yet a name spoken with reverence or caution. Not yet the man who would sit at tables where the future of entire cities was discussed in whispers. He was simply a boy who had learned that silence was a form of power, that loyalty was a form of wealth, and that the world beyond the horizon was waiting. Sicily did not vanish behind him. It settled inside him, and it would travel with him always. The ship that carried Joseph Bonanno across the Atlantic moved slowly, as though time itself had stretched. Days blurred into one another, the same restless waves, the same grey horizon, the same wind tasting of distant change. Yet, inside the young man, something was growing quietly. Not ambition, that word was too worldly. It was something subtler, something older, a sense of direction, a belief that he was not drifting, but being drawn. When New York finally emerged through a haze of early morning mist, it did not appear radiant or welcoming. The skyline, jagged and towering, rose like a wall between sea and sky. Smoke curled above factories. The harbor water, dark and restless, slapped against the dock pilings. Voices in dozens of languages collided all at once. Carried on the wet air, Joe stepped onto American soil with the calm of someone who had already decided who he intended to become. New York in the 1920s was not the myth of opportunity promised in letters sent across oceans. For the immigrants who lived in crowded tenements along Mulberry Street and beyond, life was narrow, loud, and unrelenting. Families shared rooms barely large enough for a table. Laundry lines stretched like white flags between windows. Steam rose from street drains in the winter, curling round boots, coats, and hurried footsteps. Yet there was familiarity here too. Italian voices echoed through markets. The smell of bread, garlic, and simmering tomatoes drifted through alleyways. Church bells rang, though the churches were smaller, their walls newer and lacking the weight of centuries. But most familiar of all were the silences, the ones exchanged between men who recognized one another, not by name, but by bearing. Sicilians carried the old world with them, whether they crossed an ocean or not. Joe found work quickly. Not glamorous work, not profitable work, but work that allowed him to listen. He swept floors, delivered messages, carried crates, took instructions. He observed which men others stepped aside for. He learned which conversations stopped when certain faces approached. He saw how disputes were resolved, not with shouting, but with a word given to the right person at the right time. In the right tone, power here, as in Sicily, was something quiet. There were two worlds living in the same city, one of law uniforms, badges, and official papers. The other, invisible, but far more efficient. This second world did not need law. It had memory. It had loyalty, and for those who recognized it, it had protection. Joe aligned himself with the people who had come from his own hometown, the Castellamori. They were not the most feared. They were not the richest, but they believed something that echoed deeply in him, that tradition mattered, that discipline mattered, that the organization, even here, far from Sicily, must not become loud, reckless, or greedy. To them, the Mafia was not an empire. It was a structure, a way of living without chaos. Yet the world around them was already shifting. Another faction rose under Joe Masiria, a man heavy in presence and ambition. Masiria believed in expansion, in control through fear, in showing strength like a fist pressed against the table. The Castellamoris watched him with a quiet disapproval. Not hatred. Hatred is loud. Their distrust was colder, older, rooted in the understanding that a tree that grows too quickly splits in the wind. In those early years, Joe did not speak much, but speaking was never what earned trust. Presence did. Composure did. The ability to wait, to read a situation before it unfolded. Did he attended meetings where nothing was written and everything was decided. He stood beside men who weighed loyalty without ever naming it. He walked streets where one wrong greeting could close a door forever. Slowly, the network tightened around him. He delivered messages that did not sound like messages. He carried introductions that meant more than any currency. He built a reputation not of force, but of steadiness. The kind of steadiness that others begin to rely on without realizing it. Life in Little Italy was full of contradictions. Children played ball in the streets while deals were arranged in the shade of doorways. Weddings were celebrations filled with wine, music, and joy, while the guest list itself was a map of alliances and obligations. Laughter could coexist with danger. Warmth could live beside consequence. Joe learned to move between these layers like one who had always belonged. And yet, beneath all this, a pressure was building. The Castellamoris clan and the Masiria faction shared the same city, the same streets, the same businesses, and the same ambitions. There was not enough space for two philosophies of power to grow unchecked. Joe began to see it first in whispers, conversations that ended too soon, meetings called at unusual hours. A look held 1 second longer than it should have been. The silence of New York was becoming heavier, the kind of silence that precedes a storm still. In these years, Joe was not a general. He was a student of structure, a listener, a man who understood that the deepest power was the one unseen. He attended church on Sundays. He visited friends. He walked streets without a visible guard. But inside him, the map was forming. A map of alliances, debts, opportunities, histories. a map that others could not see, a map that would one day shape the architecture of organized power in America. As the nights in New York grew colder and the tension between factions tightened, Joe continued to move with patience. He did not rush toward leadership. He did not demand recognition. He simply remained, and sometimes remaining is the first step toward inheritance. The Castellammare's war had not yet begun, but its shadow already stretched across the city. Joe Bonanno, once a quiet boy watching the horizon from the shores of Sicily, now stood within the heart of a world that was shaping itself around him, not by force, not by desire, but by destiny or something that resembled it. The city did not change all at once. It changed in glances, in whispers, in the way a man would look over his shoulder before crossing a street he once crossed without thinking. New York in the early 1930s was a landscape of uncertainty, its neighborhoods divided not by fences or borders, but by loyalties written in silence. And within this silence, two visions of power rose to face each other. On one side stood Joe Bonanno, a man who believed that control was something you took with your hands, your voice, your presence. His rule was one of appetite and force, a belief that fear alone could hold men in line. On the other was Salvatore Maranzano, who thought of power as architecture measured, structured, layered like the ancient empires whose histories he studied late into the night. He believed that order, not chaos, would define the future of their world. Joseph Bonanno was young then, but not naive. He stood beside Maranzano, not as a soldier or a mouthpiece, but as a quiet observer. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he acted. His silence was not hesitation, it was understanding. The war was not loud, though the newspapers would one day describe it as such. It moved like a shadow beneath the city's surface. Meetings were held in the back rooms of bakeries, behind shuttered blinds in rented apartments, in basements that smelled of damp stone and old wood. Men entered in twos or threes and left alone. Sometimes they did not leave at all. The streets carried the tension. A cafe chair remained empty for weeks, its absence speaking louder than any obituary. A shop closed overnight, its windows papered without explanation. Funerals were quiet affairs, held at dawn, where the only sounds were footsteps and the low murmur of prayers. Spoken more out of habit than faith, Joseph understood these absences. He understood that wars were rarely about bullets or blades. They were about choosing what kind of world one wished to inherit. Mafia represented the old hunger-raw, indiscriminate, without restraint. Maranzano, despite his own ambition, offered something that resembled structure, a way for men to belong to something larger than themselves. And Joseph, raised in a land where honor was bound to survival, recognized the difference. He did not revel in conflict. He did not seek the thrill of danger or the satisfaction of victory. What he sought was continuity, a world where loyalties meant something, where a man's word was not simply breath disappearing into air. Yet to preserve such a world, he understood that choices had to be made in darkness, without applause, without witness. The moment that shifted everything came quietly. It was arranged with careful words and careful silences. Joe Bonanno, sitting in a modest restaurant, believing himself untouchable, never expected that the men who accompanied him would step away, leaving him alone. What followed would be recorded, debated, embellished, but for Joseph, it was not the killing that mattered. It was the certainty that one era had ended. Maranzano rose in the aftermath, and for a short time his vision of order seemed to take shape. He spoke of ranks, of codes, of a structure that would endure beyond personalities or tempers. Joseph became one of his closest confidants, not because he demanded attention, but because his loyalty was unspoken and unwavering. He understood the architecture of power because he had learned it long before he ever arrived in America. Yet power invites fear, and fear invites betrayal. Maranzano's reign was brief. Those who claimed to support him began to murmur in private, questioning whether one man could command loyalty through structure alone. Among them was Lucky Luciano, who saw the future not in old empires, but in new alliances. And so, as quietly as one chapter had closed, another followed. Maranzano was taken from the world, not in spectacle, but in stillness. Sudden, decisive, irreversible, Joseph did not celebrate. He did not mourn. He understood that the world was shifting once again, moving into something neither ancient nor entirely new. The Mafia was no longer just an inheritance of Sicily. It had become an American institution, shaped by the tension between memory and opportunity. In the reorganization that followed, Joseph Bonanno became the youngest boss among the 5 families. There were no grand ceremonies, no proclamations, only a quiet acknowledgement among men who understood the language of nods and shadows. But survival, Joseph knew, was never simply the act of enduring. It required the ability to stand still in the midst of shifting ground, to understand when to speak and when to remain silent, when to step forward and when to retreat into the background. Many men lost their lives in the war because they believed that power came from noise-raised voices, bold gestures, public declarations of strength. Joseph learned that true strength was often quiet, measured, almost invisible. There were nights when he sat alone at the edge of the East River, watching the water move under the faint glow of moonlight. The city hummed around him, restless and unforgiving, yet the river remained steady, unbothered by the conflicts of men. He thought of Sicily, then the sound of waves against rocky shores, the distant call of church bells, the way the sky blushed gold at dusk. He carried those memories like a compass, guiding him through a world that often demanded he abandon sentiment entirely. Men spoke of him with curiosity. Some thought him cold. Others believed him brilliant, but most simply did not understand him. They measured power in visible acts. He measured it in endurance, in the ability to see not just the moment, but the years that would follow. This quality, this quiet, unwavering patience would shape not only the future he inherited, but the legacy he would one day leave behind. And the city, in its sprawl, took notice. He had survived the war not by force, but by patience. He rose into influence not with the roar of guns, but with the soft weight of presence. By the early 1930s, Joseph Bonanno stood at the center of a world that had reshaped itself. The old war was over. The maps of power were redrawn. His rivals had fallen to history. And Joseph, still young by the standards of the underworld, was granted a throne made not from noise, but from quiet calculation. He did not look like a gangster to those who saw him beyond the street. His suits were impeccably tailored, Italian wool pressed with care, lapels modest rather than boastful. He spoke softly, rarely lifting his voice above the warmth of conversation. He hosted dinners, family gatherings, evenings lit by amber light rather than neon. His image was of a gentleman, cultured, restrained, composed. But make no mistake, every room he entered shifted around him. Respect followed him not through fear, but through the calm assurance that he never needed to explain his power. His home became the silent capital of the newly named Bonanno family. The structure he'd built was methodical, thoughtful, and deeply rooted in loyalty. Men joined him not for chaos, but for order. He believed the Mafia was not simply crime, it was governance, structure, tradition carried from one homeland to another. Decisions flowed through quiet council, not public display. Profits were measured, consistent, and protected by patience rather than recklessness. The Bonanno family thrived in businesses that required subtlety. Labor organizations, trade networks, shipping routes, these were channels Joseph strengthened carefully. And yes, the narcotics trade formed one of his most powerful pillars. But Joseph made sure that the street-level brutality that stained other families did not stain his. He kept distance between himself and the violence necessary to maintain control. Others would carry out what must be done. He would remain the calm, unshifting center at the dinner table. He was simply a father. His children remember laughter, long meals, the clinking of glasses under warm lamplight. His wife, Faye, became the quiet anchor of their household, dignified, present, steady. For a moment, his world seemed perfectly balanced, a family in the traditional sense, and a family in the shadows. Both demanded loyalty. Both defined him. Yet, beneath this serenity, the world outside was changing. America was modernizing, speeding, brightening. Younger men in the organization saw opportunity not in patience, but in spectacle. They watched movies, admired flashy suits, wanted fast cars and louder reputations. The subtle, old-world quiet that Joseph cherished began to feel, to some, like a cage. He noticed these shifts in small ways. A younger capo wearing a ring too large, a chain too bright. Laughter that carried a little too loud in a restaurant corner. A story told twice, exaggerated the second time. The ambition of youth is rarely satisfied with shadows. They wanted light. They wanted to be seen. But Joseph had built his world on the belief that power unseen is power preserved. Those who draw attention invite danger. Those who chase glory invite downfall. He watched as other bosses across the 5 families embraced wine-soaked club nights, newspaper whispers, and public presence. He watched, and he did not approve. Still, admiration for him continued. Older members, seasoned through decades of change, trusted him. They understood the stability he offered. His leadership felt like a hearth-steady flame, controlled warmth, predictable and safe. In a world where power so often surged and collapsed like tides, Joseph was a shoreline, but time is a force no man commands. The post-war generations were born into America, not Sicily. They dreamed American dreams, not Sicilian loyalties. Their identity was not built on whispered oaths in village courtyards, but on neon lights, jazz clubs, and the promise of more. It was not betrayal, it was distance. A divergence of worlds. Joseph saw the cracks long before others acknowledged them. He noticed who hesitated before offering loyalty, who looked away too quickly in conversation, who lingered at the door just a moment longer, as though calculating another future. He adjusted, quietly. He reinforced what mattered most, the inner circle, the blood ties, the men who remembered the old roads of Castellamo del Golfo. He reminded them, not through speech, but through presence, that power could be both gentle and absolute. Still, the shift could not be stopped. A new culture was forming around him, louder and uncontrolled, and in that growing noise, the careful silence he had built began to soften at the edges. He understood leadership as an art of distance. To lead was not to be seen doing, but to create the conditions where things happened without instruction. A nod at a table could shift the direction of a business. A single pause in conversation could signal caution. Power, for Joseph, was measured by how little he needed to exert it. When he met with his closest advisors, the room would often fall into long stretches of silence, comfortable, weighted, purposeful. They shared the understanding that words were tools, not necessities. A plan spoken too loudly was already compromised. A promise repeated too often was already broken. Trust existed in what was not said. Outside, New York pulsed with restless rhythm. Streetcars rattled, markets buzzed with voices in a dozen languages, and the scent of roasted chestnuts drifted through winter air. The city was alive, hungry, always reaching. And yet, inside Joseph's world, everything moved at a different pace. Slower, more deliberate, like tides guided by the moon. It is tempting to view this period as his triumph, and in many ways it was. But every triumph contains its own shadow. Stability creates expectation. Control creates resistance. The more perfectly something is constructed, the more fragile it becomes. Joseph knew this. He felt it, like a craftsman watching a fine glass vessel take shape. He admired the beauty and feared the crack he could not yet see. That crack was coming. Small at first, invisible to most, but coming all the same. Indeed, inevitably, there is a moment in every empire when the danger does not arrive with a shout, but with a silence. When threat does not move through the streets, but through the air between two men seated at the same table. That was the world Joseph Bonanno began to sense around him. A world where rooms felt slightly colder, where smiles lingered a moment too long, where the shape of loyalty itself seemed to shift like mist under lamplight. On the surface, his organization appeared calm, prosperous, orderly. The dinners still continued. The meetings still opened with embraces and ended with blessings of health and fortune. The men still toasted to family, to honor, to the old ways. But beneath these gestures, something subtle had changed. The younger generation, raised in America rather than Sicily, spoke of ambition like it was destiny. They did not dream of preserving tradition, only of surpassing it. They saw the world not through memory, but through hunger. In quiet conversations, murmured in the corners of restaurants and back rooms of clubs, Joseph began to hear new language. Words like growth, expansion, modernization. Words that were never spoken in Sicily, where power existed not in being visible, but in being unquestioned. To Joseph, this language tasted like danger. Because ambition, when unanchored by loyalty, does not build, it devours. The commission those who governed the 5 families shared little of Joseph's sense of restraint. They admired efficiency, profit, influence that stretched beyond the docks and the markets. They attended dinners in penthouse suites, shook hands with businessmen and judges, and imagined the Mafia as something larger, louder, more American. They respected Joseph, yes, but respect, like weather, can change with pressure, and so the atmosphere shifted. Meetings that once felt familiar became careful. The tone softened, but sharpened too. Words were spoken calmly, but carried weight. A suggestion would be offered, and Joseph would answer with stillness rather than agreement. Silence became his shield. His refusal to be rushed felt, to others, like obstruction. A storm was forming, but so gently that most could not yet see its shape. Joseph began to notice the small things first. A man who used to greet him with warmth now offered only politeness. A trusted lieutenant avoided eye contact when discussing business. At dinners, seating arrangements changed not by accident, but by intention. Old allies sat farther away. New voices inserted themselves closer to the center. The language of power had shifted from loyalty to proximity. No one declared betrayal. No one needed to. Whispers traveled in the quiet hours. He is too traditional. He holds too tightly to the past. He does not understand what America is becoming. Joseph heard these rumors not directly, but through the way people moved around him. Rumors rarely speak aloud. They live in gestures. They breathe in hesitation. And so, he withdrew, not outwardly, but internally. He spoke less. He watched more. He studied the pauses between sentences. He became quieter, more deliberate, his presence now carved from patience rather than certainty. He trusted fewer people. He kept counsel only with blood, his sons, his kin, those tied not just to name but to memory. Leadership, Joseph realized, is not a crown but a solitude. He still hosted dinners. The food remained rich, the wine well chosen, the conversation warm enough to deceive a distant listener. But to Joseph, every dinner now felt like a gathering of masks. The laughter sounded rehearsed. Compliments felt practiced. Even affection had the weight of performance. He knew the men around him still respected him, but respect mixed with fear is fragile. It can shatter quietly without a sound. Conversations with the commission grew long, layered, diplomatic. Suggestions carried hidden barbs. Agreements were written in ink that felt thin and temporary. The old codes, the Sicilian codes, were no longer the foundation. They were becoming relics. Joseph believed in a world where honor held shape. The commission believed in a world where opportunity held shape. Two philosophies cannot share the same house forever, and yet nothing happened. No one struck first. No voice rose. No threats were spoken. The danger lived not in action, but in anticipation. The tension was not a clash, it was the quiet before a clash. The stillness before thunder. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. The quiet did not break until it did. The shift arrived not with ceremony, but with a phone call spoken in hushed urgency. There had been an attempt at plan whispered behind closed doors, a move half put into motion. A kidnapping, not to kill, but to remove Joseph from the board, to reshape the family in his absence, to replace tradition with something sharper. But the attempt failed, stopped perhaps by loyalty or hesitation or simply fate. Joseph did not rage. He did not threaten. He did not call for blood. He sat in silence for a long time. Then, without expression, he understood. The world he built had already begun to fracture from the commission. Came word of another whisper, an assassination plot. Quiet, veiled, deniable. A test of loyalty disguised as strategy. No one claimed responsibility. No one admitted knowledge. The rooms where men once met as brothers now breathed with suspicion. This was not war, not yet. War announces itself. This was something colder, something that unfolds in the space between heartbeats. A slow unweaving of trust, a quiet rewriting of futures. The storm was no longer distant. It had arrived, and it was already inside the walls. The winter arrived quietly that year, as though the city itself wished to soften what was coming. Snow drifted through the Brooklyn air in slow, deliberate spirals, settling on rooftops, quieting the streets, muting footsteps and voices. It was the kind of winter that made men think of old promises, of debts owed, of favors once exchanged beneath warmer skies. Yet beneath the stillness, something restless moved, something cold and calculating. The commission had always been an uneasy truce, a structure of fragile balance held together by necessity more than trust. It was designed to prevent wars, to settle disputes, to ensure that profit did not drown itself in blood. But, like all structures created by men, it aged, it shifted, it bent beneath the weight of ego and ambition. And when something bends long enough, it begins to crack. Joseph Bonanno had built his world upon silence, upon patience, upon the belief that power was strongest when unseen. But silence can become distance, and distance can become threat. The other bosses began to speak of him not with admiration, but with caution. He was too quiet, they said, too separate, too unwilling to share what he knew. Meetings were held without him. Conversations paused when his name was spoken. Decisions were passed across tables where his chair remained empty. No one declared him an enemy. No one spoke of betrayal. Instead, they allowed the absence to speak for them. There are moments in history when power shifts without sound. No shots fired. No streets stained. Only the slightest change in posture, the faintest turning of eyes. That was how it began. One evening, a message arrived. It did not accuse, nor demand, nor explain. It simply said that the commission believed Joseph Bonanno had grown too large for the space he occupied, too independent, too sovereign, a house within a house, a kingdom within a kingdom. And kingdoms have a way of demanding loyalty to themselves above all. Shortly after, he vanished. Some said he had been taken, forced into the back seat of a waiting car, driven to an apartment where voices spoke in quiet tones and guarantees were extracted like marrow from bone. Others believed he had gone willingly, slipping away to negotiate in the shadows, to preserve a future for his family. And there were those who whispered that he had orchestrated his own disappearance to test those who claimed loyalty to him. No one knew the truth. No one asked. In their world, questions could be more dangerous than answers. His absence was like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were slow, but they reached every shore. The family he had built with such care began to fracture. Some believed he would return and restore order. Others feared aligning with a ghost. The young, restless men at the edges of his power saw opportunity where others saw danger. Loyalty, once iron, now bent under the quiet pressure of uncertainty. Meetings were held in dimly lit rooms where cigars, burned low and whiskey glasses, trembled with unspoken tension. Men who had once been brothers now weighed one another like traders at a market. A word here, a glance there, the tilt of a head, all became declarations of intent. And yet, through it all, there was no war. Not truly. Just a slow unraveling of threads that had bound them together. A family unknitting itself in silence. The commission watched. It did not gloat, nor rush, nor interfere. It allowed gravity to do what violence could not, separate a man from what he built. Months passed, winter thawed, though the cold did not leave. And then, one day, Joseph Bonanno returned. He did not come with armies or declarations. He did not summon men to swear fealty. He simply stepped back into the world, wearing the same calm expression he always had. But his eyes were different. They held distance, not exile, but understanding. He had seen something in those months, something that took the warmth from his gaze. The streets recognized him. the doorways, the long hallways of the social clubs, but the men inside did not rise quite as quickly. Their greetings, though polite, were shaped by hesitation, not disrespect, but uncertainty. They did not know who he was now, or what he had become. He looked upon his family and saw not unity, but fractures, not loyalty, but fear. The young had rushed forward, the old had retreated. The middle stood waiting for direction that no longer felt clear. It was a house still standing, but its foundation had shifted when no one was watching. Power, once effortless, now required force. He had spent his life believing that true power did not need to announce itself, that influence moved best through stillness. But now he saw that stillness, left too long, could be mistaken for absence. An absence could be filled by those whose ambitions did not care for old codes or quiet dignity. He had returned to a world that no longer mirrored the one he had shaped. The city had grown louder. The young had grown hungry. The shadows had become crowded. His virtues, once seen as strength, now resembled hesitation. The commission had not destroyed him. They had simply waited long enough for the world to change around him, and so he stood in a place that had once been his kingdom, watching the quiet echo of his own empire move without him. A man still feared, still respected, but no longer central. He had not been defeated by force. He had been defeated by time, and time, unlike men, cannot be bargained with. He understood then that legacy is not something one keeps by holding tighter. It drifts, slowly, like snow melting under a weak sun. He had survived wars and silence, but the world had continued without him. In that realization, a quiet truth settled. Nothing remains unchanged tonight. The desert is a place that does not speak unless spoken to. It waits, it watches, it listens. In the quiet heat of Arizona, where the sun falls hard upon stone and sky stretches endlessly without interruption, Joseph Bonanno lived out the final decades of his life, far from the narrow sidewalks of Brooklyn, far from the murmured conversations in back rooms, far from the shifting alliances that once determined the direction of entire cities. Here there was only silence, and the slow passing of days that arrived without urgency. His home was modest, though carefully kept. A low-walled courtyard surrounded by citrus trees, their leaves catching the light at sunrise, glowing softly like stained glass. He tended them himself. Each morning, he walked among them with pruning shears in hand, moving slowly, as though measuring the distance of each memory before it reached him. The air carried the faint scent of dust and oranges. The wind moved gently, the way a whisper moves when it already knows the answer. Joseph Bonanno had not chosen exile. Exile had chosen him. Yet he accepted it as one might accept a season, not with enthusiasm, but with understanding that resistance would change nothing. The world he had shaped, the world he had held together through quiet discipline and unspoken law, had shifted into something unrecognizable. Men who once spoke in coded discretion now made headlines. Secrets once kept in the marrow of families now spilled into newspapers and courtrooms. And the very word Mafia, once never spoken aloud, now floated carelessly through television screens and street conversations. Stripped of its weight, he observed it all from distance, his eyes carrying neither anger nor regret, but something quieter, something that resembled sorrow. He ate meals with his family at a long wooden table, its surface worn smooth from years of hands resting upon it. The conversations were light, gentle, domestic. His children asked about the past, sometimes directly, sometimes in careful fragments. But he gave them little, not out of denial, nor pride, nor fear, but because some stories are shaped not by what is said, but by what remains unspoken. His silence was not a withholding. It was a form of loyalty, an old code that no longer had a place in the world, yet had never left him. He walked each afternoon through the desert paths near his home, where cactus and stone stood like monuments that had never known decay. The landscape was harsh, but honest. Nothing pretended to be more than it was. In this place, his thoughts unfolded slowly. He wondered not about the decisions he had made, but about the reasons behind them, the forces that shaped him long before power ever did. Was loyalty a form of strength? Or had it been a shield against the loneliness of being one man among many shadows? Had he maintained the code because he believed in it, or because he feared what would remain if it was taken away? There were no answers in the desert, only questions that moved in wide, unbroken circles, returning always to where they started. His wife sat with him in the evenings, knitting while the sun descended behind the mountains, turning the sky into a tapestry of muted gold and deepening violet. Their conversations were simple, shared observations, warm tea, the soft rustle of yarn. It was a life without war, without strategy, without watchfulness. But peace is not ease. Even in silence, shadows do not disappear. They simply grow longer. He remembered the faces of men who had once stood beside him, their names now scattered across newspapers, indictments, memoirs, and whispered legends. Some had died quietly, others violently. Others still had chosen to speak to the government, something that in his youth would have been unthinkable, unspeakable, undefendable. But the world had changed. The old pillars had fallen. Men no longer feared silence. They feared invisibility. The trials unfolded on screens he did not turn on. But he heard enough, always, from passing remarks, from newspapers left folded on cafe tables, from the low murmur of voices in restaurants that fell quiet when he entered. He was not forgotten. He had simply stepped aside. There were those who believed he had outlived his world by luck. Others believed by wisdom. But the truth was simpler. He had outlived it because he had never allowed himself to belong entirely to it. He had always remained slightly apart, even when he led. Perhaps this distance had protected him. Perhaps it had cost him everything. In the desert, time moves differently, not in days or minutes, but in the slow shifting of light, the gradual smoothing of stone by wind, the growth of roots deep beneath the earth. Joseph adjusted to this rhythm easily. He had always lived life not in haste, but in silence. Visitors came on rare occasions. Old comrades, older now, their hair thin, their voices softened. They spoke carefully, as though the walls themselves might misunderstand. But their conversations were not of strategies or alliances. They spoke of families, of aging, of the strange surprise of still being alive. Sometimes, when they left, Joseph stood at the door a long while, watching the dust settle behind their cars. The desert always regained its silence quickly. It never held on to disturbance. Late at night, the house would settle into stillness. The lights dim, the citrus trees sway beyond the windows, and he would sit at the edge of his bed, hands resting quietly on his knees, staring into the dark, not as a man haunted by ghosts, but as one who recognizes them and knows they cannot be sent away. He did not write memoirs. He did not seek to correct history or justify his life. He allowed others to tell the stories, the journalists, the courts, the books. He understood something they did not. That truth is not something that can be captured. It is carried, and each man carries his differently. The desert wind moved through the courtyard, warm and steady. He closed his eyes and listened to it. In its voice, he heard Sicily. He heard the sea. He heard the laughter of friends long gone. He heard all the choices that had shaped him. Folding into one another like layers of earth, he had survived. But survival is not victory, and it is not peace. It is simply what remains. He had once been a man surrounded by whispers, by silent nods in dimly lit rooms, by the quiet respect of men who understood the gravity of his presence. But now, in the later years of his life, Joseph Bonanno found himself surrounded by sunlight, open windows, and the soft crackle of paper. The world he had shaped no longer resembled him, and perhaps he no longer resembled the man who once shaped it. In Arizona, time passed differently. The desert did not care for legacy or power. It reduced everything to its essential bones. Rocks turned to sand. Sand drifted with the wind. And a man, no matter how formidable, became a whisper in his own memory. Bonanno lived in this quiet place, not hidden, but removed like a shadow stepping back into the periphery of the world. Yet even in retreat, his story was not finished. His silence had always been his armor, but now he began to speak. He wrote his memoir, a calm and measured telling of a life spent balancing loyalty, ambition, and survival. Some called it a betrayal. Others called it preservation. But the truth was simpler. It was the last act of a man who no longer wished to be misunderstood. He did not write to confess. He wrote to remember. The pages did not tremble with guilt or regret. They were deliberate, steady, and almost gentle. Not a defense, not an apology only, a statement of how he had seen the world, and how the world had seen him. Two younger men in the life. His memoir was an enigma. How could a man who had once ruled his family with such controlled silence suddenly place his voice into the public sphere? Some believed he wished to secure his own legacy before others rewrote it. Others believed it was the final challenge he posed to the world that had tried to remove him. But perhaps it was something quieter. A man grows old. The past gathers behind him like a long shadow, and eventually he must decide what will remain when he is gone. The Mafia he had known was already fading. The codes he lived by, omerta, loyalty, discretion, were becoming relics. Trials swept through the families. Names were spoken aloud in courtrooms. The newspapers printed the private language of the streets as headlines. The underworld became spectacle, exposed, impatient. It was everything he had worked to avoid. He had always believed that silence was strength, that the most enduring power was the kind that needed no announcement. But the world was changing, and the younger generation had not learned to fear the weight of quiet conviction. His children grew into this world, shaped by memory and caution. They understood that legacy was not a monument, but a burden. They walked with the awareness that history was not only inherited, but demanded something in return. And Joseph watched, not with pride or sorrow, but with a calm acceptance that the world would continue without him. The sun would rise over the desert, the wind would carry sand across the courtyard, and the things he once fought to hold together would move on according to their own nature. In his final years, he did not seek to reclaim control, nor to justify what had been done. He understood that power was temporary, but impact lingered in quieter ways. a conversation remembered decades later, a decision that shaped the tone of a family's values, a silence that told a story deeper than any confession. History would debate him. Some would call him the last of the old world Donza, man of principle in a world that abandoned principle. Others would call him a contradiction preaching loyalty while navigating ambition. Both were true, and neither could fully contain the man he was. For the world does not remember people as they were. It remembers symbols, shapes, impressions left in the dust of time. And Joseph Bonanno, whether he intended to or not, became a symbol. The last Don, they said, not because he was the final leader of his kind, but because he represented the moment when the old world took its final breath before dissolving into something louder, messier, and less certain. He lived long enough to watch his story become myth, and in the quiet desert evenings, when the light faded and shadows stretched across the ground, he would sit and watch the day soften into night. There was no triumph in his expression, no bitterness either, only the stillness of a man who had seen his life from both within and without. As age settled into his bones, he found himself moving more slowly through his home. The air was warm, but his steps were measured, deliberate, as though each movement carried the weight of decades. Memory came in fragments, no faces half-lit by lamplight. Distant laughter, the faint scent of wine and cigar smoke drifting through the past like a half-remembered dream. He did not chase these memories, nor did he shy away from them. They came as they wished, and he accepted them as they were. Visitors would sometimes arrive, reporters, historians, curious seekers, hoping to glimpse the final remnants of a world that had nearly vanished. They asked questions shaped by fascination, misunderstanding, and the desire to turn a life into a legend. Bonanno answered little, not out of secrecy anymore, but because he understood that truth was not something that could be given. It had to be earned, understood, lived through, and most had not lived through it. There were also gatherings with family, conversations unhurried. The past was rarely mentioned directly, but it existed in the pauses, in the careful choice of words, in the shared awareness of everything that had come before. Love endured where history could not, and so the days unfolded without urgency or regret, a life defined not by victory or defeat, but by endurance. And perhaps that is the most human legacy of all. He lived longer than almost anyone expected, longer than the world that had shaped him, longer even than many of the memories that once held him firmly in their grasp. Joseph Bonanno died at the age of 97, in his home in Arizona, surrounded by family. There was no headline shock, no whispered rumors in back rooms, no hurried footsteps in the night. His passing was quiet, gentle, almost unremarkable. A life that had been built in shadows and silence, concluded in silence once again. The world had changed by then. The families he had once led or influenced were scattered to fragments. Their feuds had burned out or exploded into chaos, leaving behind the remnants of something that no longer resembled the careful structure he had once defended. Younger men no longer spoke his name with fear or reverence, but as a distant story, something that belonged to a past that felt unreal to them. His children were at his bedside in those final days, moving softly through rooms filled with desert light. They did not speak much about the past. They did not need to. It lived inside the very air they breathed, the shape of the family they had always known. Bonanno himself was calm, his eyes still alert though softened with age. Whatever battles he had fought, whatever storms he had endured, now rested far behind him. like distant waves that no longer reached the shore. There were no dramatic confessions, no final declarations, just the gentle passing of time, the slow unwinding of a life lived with intention. He had always believed that control was the essence of survival. Perhaps now, in the final quiet, control meant letting go. When the news of his death spread, it was met not with outrage or fascination, but with a muted acknowledgement. The world had already moved on. The era he represented had faded into nostalgia and cautionary tales. Yet there was something remarkable in this quiet ending. A man whose life had once intersected with violence, loyalty, strategy, and unspoken codes had died at home, peacefully. In the warmth of his family's presence, history rarely grants such conclusions. His funeral was small, private, almost invisible to the public eye. Those who attended did so with a solemn understanding that the man they laid to rest was not simply a figure of crime, nor a mythic leader, but a human being shaped by a time and place that no longer existed. There were no speeches of grandeur, no sweeping tributes, only a stillness, a kind of reverence that did not seek to explain or justify, only to acknowledge. Some might say that his long life was a victory. Others might say it was a distant sad expanse separating him from the consequences of his life's work. But perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was simply the result of a man who knew how to move carefully through the world, who understood the gravity of silence, who avoided the reckless hunger that consumed others around him. The desert wind continued to blow across the landscape he had chosen for his retirement, carrying dust across stone, reshaping the earth in ways so slow they could only be seen with time. In many ways, it mirrored the gradual fading of his legacy. He had once been a central figure in an underworld defined by secrecy and hierarchy. Now, he was a story told in low voices, remembered more for what he represented than for what he did. But stories have a way of echoing, even after the world forgets the exact details. Something remains, a feeling, a shape, a lesson. Bonanno's legacy was not simply his involvement in crime or his leadership in the Mafia. It was the quieter truth that power is always temporary, that the structures we build eventually outgrow us, and that the past, no matter how carefully guarded, will someday belong to those who did not live through it. He lived in a world governed by codes, loyalty, silence, identity. Those codes were not written in books or spoken aloud, but carried in the breath and blood of those who believed in them. And now, those codes exist only in fading memory, replaced by a world that speaks too loudly, too quickly, without the weight of consequence. His death did not mark the end of an era. The era had ended long before. His passing was simply the final acknowledgement of that truth, a closing of the last door in the years that followed. His name would appear occasionally in documentaries, books, and quiet recollections. Yet these retellings could never capture what it truly meant to stand in the presence of a world defined by silence. They were interpretations, some admiring, some condemning, none complete. What remained was the echo, the soft, lingering awareness that behind the modern world of noise and spectacle, there had once been another way of moving through life, a way that required patience, discipline, and an unspoken understanding of one's place in a fragile balance, as the desert sun sets each evening, casting long shadows across the sand. One can imagine him there, walking alone in the courtyard, hands behind his back, eyes distant but steady. A man who had learned to accept both the weight and the impermanence of his existence. There is no judgment here, only reflection, every life shapes the world in some way. And perhaps that is all any of us can hope for. That when the final day arrives, the world does not roar, but simply remembers that we once lived, once chose, once walked beneath the same sun. Memory has a way of reshaping itself over time. It softens certain edges, sharpens others, and blurs the spaces in between. The past is never as clear as we imagine it to be. It is not a fixed record, but a quiet river, always shifting, always revising its course. The story of Joseph Bonanno is no different. It exists now as a collection of recollections, fragments of truth suspended within interpretation and silence. He was not a legend when he lived. Legends come later, shaped by those who retell stories in whispers and in awe. He was, in his own eyes, simply a man of his place and his time born into perdition, woven into a world that could not exist without hierarchy, loyalty, and a careful kind of restraint. To him, order was not tyranny. It was survival. In Sicily, where he learned the first rhythms of power, order was the thread that held everything together. When he crossed the ocean, he carried that thread with him. And for a time, he wove something coherent out of it. A family, a structure, a balance. Not perfect, not peaceful, but stable enough to endure. Historians, commentators, and storytellers try to define him. Some call him a visionary, someone who understood that power must be quiet to survive. Others say he was a relic, a man who held so tightly to tradition that he failed to see how the world was changing around him. And there are those who see contradiction. A man who demanded silence, yet later wrote his own story. A man who asked for loyalty, yet withdrew from the people who gave it to him. But perhaps every life is contradictory when viewed too closely. His story is not simply about crime or power. It is about the longing to belong to something enduring, the desire to construct a world that feels predictable when everything outside feels dangerously uncertain. In his youth, he watched empires fall, borders dissolve, and the rules of life shift without warning. Stability, to him, was not an indulgence. It was a necessity, and yet the world he built did not last. The structure fractured, the families splintered. The code of silence he once held sacred became something others discarded when the weight of consequence grew too heavy to bear. The institutions of law changed. The eyes of the public grew hungry for spectacle. The underworld, once hidden, moved closer to stage and spotlight, and the old way, the quiet way, began to fade. But memory does not care about victory or defeat. It cares about resonance. We remember him not because he won or lost, but because he represented a certain stillness in a world defined by noise. He understood the power of the unsaid. He believed that silence could be a fortress, and even in exile, even in retreat, that belief remained with him. The city where his empire once lived carries traces of him still, not in monuments or plaques or notable landmarks, but in the feeling of certain neighborhoods, in the narrow streets where old men sit outside, small cafes speaking softly over small cups of coffee, in the way some families still speak of respect as though it was something physical that could be held in the hand, in the quiet understanding that some loyalties do not require words. New York remembers everything, even when it does not speak of it. There are nights when rain falls softly over Brooklyn streets, gathering along sidewalks, sliding between the cracks of brick buildings older than most of the city's history. On such nights, the past feels close. The silence of those years returns, not with drama, not with threat, but with the gentle reminder that the world was once slower, more deliberate, more concerned with what remained hidden than what could be seen in the rain's quiet rhythm. The old world breathes, just for a moment. What remains of Joseph Bonanno is not a lesson of right or wrong. It is a question, one that echoes across time. What does it mean to live a life shaped by loyalty? Is loyalty strength? Or is it a fear of standing alone? Was he protecting a way of life? Or was he protecting himself from the uncertainty of change? There are no definitive answers. History rarely offers them. People live in complexities that stories cannot fully contain. Yet there is something to be learned from his journey, not in the actions themselves, but in the stillness between them, the pauses, the silences, the unspoken acknowledgements, the understanding that every life, no matter how large or small, will eventually become memory. We choose how we carry that memory. Some will remember violence, some will remember strategy, some will remember a man walking alone in a sunlit courtyard in Arizona, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes holding storms that no longer reached him. But perhaps the most truthful memory is the simplest one. He lived in accordance with what he believed even when the world changed around him. The story ends not with judgment, but with a kind of soft acceptance. Legacy is not what we leave behind in records or accomplishments. It is the shape we leave in the lives we pass through, the echo that remains when our footsteps fade. And so, the rain continues to fall. The city continues to breathe. The world moves forward, always changing, always forgetting and, yet always remembering in ways that cannot be named. Joseph Bonanno's life has ended, but his echo remains, not loud, not triumphant, but quiet, steady, like the sound of distant rain against a window in the early hours before dawn. The kind of sound that lingers, long after everything else has passed.